fundraising operations professionals. Hosted by fund miner co-founders Chelsea Lamego and Alejandro Stevenson Duran. In this episode, we explored how the art of positive communication theory and practice can be applied to the fundraising and development world.
Welcome to the Impact Unplugged podcast. We're your hosts, Chelsea Lamego
and Alejandro Stevenson Duran. Tune into the Impact Unplugged podcast, where we share advancement and nonprofit best practices and trends from industry experts and thought leaders.
Today, we have the honor of interviewing Dr. Julien C. Mirivel. He's an award-winning teacher and scholar and a professor of applied communication at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock, as well as an accomplished author and professional speaker. Originally from Paris, France, he is among the founding scholars in the emerging field of positive communication, and in 2013, he was named a Distinguished Teaching Fellow at UA Little Rock. Julien has published in the most rigorous journals in the field of communication and is the author of 4 books on positive communication. Dr. Mirivel has delivered hundreds of keynotes, training, and workshops on how to communicate effectively. He's a TEDx speaker whose mission is to inspire individuals and groups to communicate more positively at work and at home. And he is also the founder of the Positive Communication Network. His work has also been featured in Fast Company, CEO World Magazine, HR Morning, and more. Now, when I first met Julien, he was presenting on the art of positive communication at the Council for Aid and Support of Education conference. It was a District 4 conference about 4 or 5 years now. And he was co-presenting with his director of development, where they really talked about applying his theory to the world of fundraising. And it was a talk that I have never forgotten. So fast forward several years later, and I still keep a card next to my desk of his model. So super excited to be interviewing Dr. Mirivel today. Welcome to the show, and would love to have you tell us about these 4 books that you've published.
Hey, thank you so much, Chelsea and Alejandro. It's so nice to be with you today. I'm happy to do that. So I've written 4 books, but most of the thread of my work is really about helping people and really thinking about how to communicate more positively in my own life and helping other people do so as well. So the common thread is, how can we communicate more positively, at work? How can we develop those skills effectively so that we can reach people and connect more meaningfully? And then, of course, in the world of raising, right, how can we cultivate these meaningful relationships in ways that will help us raise for particularly student scholarships? So I'm looking forward to engaging in this conversation. It all began really with my first book called The Art of Positive Communication, Theory and Practice. And then my most recent book is Positive Communication for Leaders. But I'm sure we're going to explore some of these ideas together.
Yes. Thank you very much. And let's start at the beginning. Your first book, The Art of Positive and Communication, Theory and Practices. Can you talk a little bit about us? Give us a 10,000 foot view of the main ideas that you explored in this piece of work.
Sure. So really, and that book was published in 2014. So we're about to celebrate the 10-year anniversary of that book, but it really set in motion everything that I do today, actually. And Chelsea just showed this little card that she's got. You can see I've got it too. And it was really the book where I introduced a very simple model that I believe could help people communicate more positively in their lives. So my basic impulse is, I've been a communication professor my whole life. All of my degrees are in this field, and I wanted to help people communicate better, including myself, I'll say. And so in the book, I introduced this model that Chelsea has made reference to now and that I just showed you on this little card, which has kind of 6 behaviors that are at the heart, in my mind, about how you can communicate more positively with other people. I saw those behaviors, just before I kind of get into them, I saw them as kind of the white belt moves. If you practice martial arts, you always start with a white belt and then you get better, right? White belt, green belt, blue belt, brown belt, black belt. And I wanted those behaviors to be simple enough that they would be white belt kind of moves, but that they could become, with practice, black belt performances. So the 6 behaviors, which I tied to principles, sound like this. First behavior is, when we greet, we have the ability to create connection When we ask questions, we have the ability to discover the unknown. When we compliment, we have the ability to affect people, both who they are in the moment, but more importantly, who they become. When we disclose, we have the ability to deepen relationships with others. When we encourage, we can use communication as a gift and give people the support they need to succeed or overcome challenges or even a crisis. And then finally, when we choose to listen deeply, we can transcend the perceived differences that exist between you and I. And so here was the model, these 6 principles. They culminate with the idea of influencing and inspiring, because I believe if you really want to make an impact as a leader, as a person, as a parent, as a teacher, whatever your role might be, that in the end, you have to model that behavior. You can't expect it of others. You have to do it. And the more you do it, then that's the most powerful way of really persuading others to do it too. So that's a
Understood.
10,000 feet view.
Love it, and thanks for also touching on your motivations for starting this work. Now, as far as these sort of 6-part model, can you tell us about how how you were when you were developing this? What were some of the biggest challenges or top considerations that, even though you didn't have anything laid out, you knew you needed to hit on these very strong points?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I actually don't get that question very often, but it began really with a very deep reflection about what I was learning from my own field. So the field of communication has an established body of work, theories, empirical research, ideas that date all the way to Aristotle. So 2,500 years ago, people were talking about persuasion, right? And the art of persuasion. So you look at this huge body of work, but somehow we were not teaching our students and people in the general public how they might use this body of work in a very practical way. So the first thing that I really started doing was looking to my discipline for answers. What are the common threads? Think of this like a synthesis. What does the research on the best managers show us about how they lead people? What do the best leaders do when they create a positive workplace culture? What do the best fundraisers? I've worked in fundraising. There are people who are really good at it and people who are not so good at it, just like in any profession. So what do the top fundraisers do when they interact with potential donors or prospective donors? So I wanted to know what the research would show me. So that was one kind of explanation. The second thing I really wanted to know is what have I been learning this whole time? I've got a PhD in communication, a master's in communication, a bachelor's. I've been publishing within this body of work. What are we learning? So that's one consideration. The other was very practical. I started to pay attention to my own communication. I'm going to share a few things. So for example, in the model, I talk about this idea of greeting, right? But if you pay attention to yourself, you'll notice that sometimes you feel very comfortable moving towards people. You feel like you're engaged. You feel like you're with them. And there are sometimes when you feel like withdrawing. You don't want to be part of the interaction. You're shying away from it. Maybe you're even losing some confidence. So I started to pay attention to some of my own tendencies and kind of pressures, right? Am I moving towards people or am I moving away from people? So that's the power of greeting, and we can talk more about it later. Or say, one of the behaviors is complimenting. So I'm like, started thinking like, how much of my time do I spend complimenting the people in my life? Or do I spend most of that time criticizing, right? So it began really by thinking, one, what is the body of literature is teaching me? What are some of the challenges that I face in my own communication sphere? And then the third really was as a teacher, so by training, I'm a faculty member. I've started teaching when I was 21 years old, so I love being in the classroom. And so it really was about how can I teach my students to develop communication habits that would stay with them? Because you can teach something and it can completely be forgotten. But I want to teach something and I want it to be stuck with them. And so that's how the model kind of came together. In fact, every student of mine will get a copy of this and maybe they put it on their fridge. And so when they forget what I've taught them, they still have the model with them.
Love it. I think I'm going to have to get a copy myself. I'm feeling a little bit left out that I only have a digital copy.
Yeah, no worries. I'll get you one.
So,
Appreciate it.
Julian, you talked a little bit about how this model, how you've used this model in real life and in your work practice. And going back to when I first met you and you were presenting with your director of development, curious, how did you take your model and the work that you do and the skills that you have around building these relationships? And during your time when you were involved in fundraising, working with that director of development, what were some of the tools that you used? What were some of the things that you realized, some of the overlap as well?
Yeah, wow. I mean, it was quite a journey. So as you mentioned, for a while, for 3 years, I served as dean of a college, and I worked every day with my awesome director of development, Christina, who was kind of, we called ourselves the dream team of development, because together we felt like we could just accomplish so much, and we did. I think before I stepped as dean, the college was raising such low amount for our students. I think it was $30,000 a year. By the time Christina and I worked together for 3 years, we had raised $3 million for students. So we really enjoyed that. So how did I apply
Wow.
this? So the model for me, and you can see that in my most recent book, it was, as a leader, how can I embody this model? And particularly with my relationship with Christina, how can I then try to create this strong connection so that her and I can become this dream team? And not just me, it's also her. She's really wonderful to work with, but I think we really try to practice this model together. So that was one element, and I can kind of maybe unpack a few examples of that. The second thing is with meeting with donors, is trying to apply this model within that context, right? So you take something as simple as this. When I first got into the role, it's pretty common for deans in particular to get into the fundraising process much later on. The director of development will make initial visits. They may even make 2 or 3 points of contact, sometimes more. And then the dean gets brought in later on in the process, sometimes for the ask, sometimes not even for that process. And one of the things that Christina and I did is I wanted to be involved almost immediately, meaning, I wanted to build these relationships with people. If you're going to ask for $1 million for your school or for your program in the college, you want to build that connection from the very ground up. So for me, applying the first principle is greeting to create human connection. So the way you start interactions is really critical. Are you warm? Are you open? Are you embracing the moment? Are you fully present? Are you welcoming? Your communication has to do that with donors, and it has to be genuine. It can't be faked, because people sense it very quickly. So that would be one example of how I incorporated that into the fundraising process. Maybe you've got some other questions you want me to either pursue or continue on.
Yeah, I love too that, and I saw this in a prior one of your talks, and I think it was quoting someone else even, where the author said, "Good communication comes down to your ability to ask questions," and that
Yes.
really stuck with me because when thinking about communicating with your donors and trying to identify that overlap and what the affinity is and what area on campus they'll support, for example, learning to ask questions and being able to identify what pulls at their heart and what they really care about supporting.
Yeah, and again, that's something I think Christina and I felt really passionate about, is that we always went into a mode of discovery when we met with our donors. And the second principle of the model is that when you ask questions, you put yourself in a position of discovery, right? You're going on a quest now. It's a totally different impulse. One way of doing fundraising is you impose, you're like, okay, the dean is dreaming of this, or we need this. Let's go tell the donor what we need. But that rarely works, because at the end of the day, donors have passions. They have things that they really believe in. And so we made our job really all about meeting donors' dreams and figuring out, what do they love? What do they want to do? What are they passionate about? And sometimes that takes a little bit of time and process, right? Because they may not even know. So sometimes it's simply introducing them. Maybe we put some students in front of them to see how that goes. Maybe we ask them to give a talk to a class to see how that goes. Or we show them a center where new research is being done and we see how that goes. So we have to go on a quest to say, here's the discovery. And some of our best gifts, not always the highest one, but I think the most meaningful ones took place through these conversations because we had built these connections. I'll give you an example. After building this connection with one of our donors, at some point he said, well, we had discovered in the college actually that so many of our students were so close to graduating that all they needed was like one or two classes to finish their classes. And I think this is a dominant pattern across all universities.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just having this chat with one of our donors, and he said, we have to get these students graduating. That's just not just for their lives, but also for the economy and for the university. And so he became super passionate about this. And the moment we mentioned this, we tapped into the passion. And of course, he was willing to do anything. We created a whole scholarship for our students called the Last Mile, a Last Mile scholarship, which was all about getting donors to give to this idea that, which was real, that students needed $500 to finish a class, right? Their car broke down. They had 116 credits. They need 120 credits to graduate, and they can't afford it. So can we get them to graduation? And it was, for me, one of the most heartwarming and pleasant experiences to make that happen. But it began with discovery, for sure.
I love that. Well, it began with discovery, but then also you disclosed a bit, right, to build that relationship more. And so it was really building that narrative together, and that seemed to have really deepened that relationship and had the best outcome for a lasting partnership.
Yeah, well, so as you pointed out, the fourth principle of the model is that when we are able to disclose authentically and genuinely, we tend to deepen relationships. My co-author for my latest book, Positive Communication for Leaders, Alex Lyon, he always calls this behavior the magic wand of communication. He says it's the magic wand because, if I disclose a little bit about me in a real authentic way, then what tends to happen is people reciprocates, right? I disclose and then the next person discloses. And the magic that actually happens is that people get kind of closer as a result of that. So in our approach to fundraising, I think Christina and I were all about building, and I always want to say Christina and I because it was impossible to do it without her. She would need to be part of this whole process for it to be successful. So we really wanted to build this authentic relationship. And so our approach was very much aimed with that kind of principle, which meant we would disclose what we were passionate about. We would disclose what we were up to. We were very transparent. Here are some of the issues going on in the college or problems that we need solved. And not always connected to an ask, but telling people, here's what's going on. Sometimes we told donors something very personal about our challenges. I had donors who became mentors of mine as I struggle with some leadership challenges. So I think being open to that connected people. And I have to say, we had a community advisory council, and the people on that council were really deeply connected to each other and to me and Christina in very powerful ways as a result.
I love that. The other thing that comes to mind, and of course, there's all of the relationship building with the donors. You're communicating with them to hopefully get their support of your
Right.
programs. But then once you have the support, the communication with them from there is almost even more important.
That's correct.
We have this, statistic that we refer to all the time, where 8 out of 10 donors today want to see proof of impact in exchange for their continued support. So it's really critical that nonprofit, charitable organizations, universities that are fundraising are maintaining that communication post-gift and really communicating impact back with donors. And you said something in one of our prior calls that really stuck with me, and I would love for you to elaborate on that, but it was, what is not expressed has no impact.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. So that is something that I talk to people quite a bit because in the world of relationships and in the world of communication, what you do not say has no impact. And we think it does, right? We think, oh, I have this really positive thought, and but that's not going to do anything. The other person doesn't have access to your thoughts. So typically I tell people do not have access to your thoughts. They do not have access to your heart, really. They don't know how you feel, They can't read you that much. What they do have access to is your communication, is what you say and what you do. And so with donors in particular, it's the same principle. They do not know the impact unless you share what that impact has been. And for us, that was a big part of our strategy as well, to make sure that we closed the loop with donors and continued. I think part of what we do too is sometimes once the gift is being made, then the investment in the relationship goes down, right? And I think the opposite should happen. So the gift is now taking place. Really, in the cycle of development, you want only to go up. You want the relationship to increase, the gifts to become more meaningful, and to continue to develop that connection. So disclosure is one way of doing that. Listening deeply is another way of doing that. Creating opportunities for frequent connection is a part of that. And as we were having this interview, I was just realizing, like yesterday, I was texting with the chair of the community advisory board that I was leading now in 2020. So I was dean between 2017 and 2020. So 4 years later, we're still have maintained that friendship, even though I'm not making any asks for development funds, And so that to me illustrates what I'm trying to describe, which is that you've got a job to do, but the relationship is actually what's going to stay with you.
Love that. And I think one of the hardest parts of disclosure, and here we come into that fourth step that you talked about, Doctor, earlier, is in the beginning of the relationship, especially as the gift was been made. Perhaps donors are made promises or intentions of like, hey, this is how we want to honor your intent, right? And sometimes those promises are a bit more vague. Sometimes they're very specific.
Sure.
I would imagine communication plays a very key role in making sure that this side, the side of, in your case, the university, maintains credibility and maintains rapport. Can you talk a little bit about how you folks would leverage your communication skills and this model to really make sure that your university remains intact when it comes to reputation, and that the rapport with the donor is fully honored?
Yeah, well, there's lots of strategies, right? All of them involve personal touch and work. So, one thing we know from donors as well is that they really need to be thanked for their contribution. And sometimes people underplay that, right? It's very common for donors to not even get a thank you from the fundraising team for a gift that they've made, to be ignored. So no matter how small or how big, we want to do that. So as a leader, for example, Christina and I, these are just examples, by the way. They don't have to be what you do. They're just things that we did to try to honor, one, this model that I really believe in, and then to try to do it in our own job. But on Fridays, we had in our calendar, gratitude time. So this was every Friday from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4. We would write letters and notes of gratitude to our donors for the week. And this was not something we would do once in a while when we felt like it. We did it every Friday during a specific time. Often we had a process. So sometimes Christina would lead some of this and I would add a message, or we would, and in some cases I would lead it depending on the situation. So that's one thing. The other is very frequent email communication with updates to those stakeholders about what we're doing. So if people have invested in our Last Mile Scholarship, they want to hear student stories about students succeeding, right? So that's what Chelsea, I think, is getting at as well. They want to see the impact. So we built in monthly newsletters or a monthly email that goes, here's where we are, here's what's happening, here's the impact that your gift is having. We're having face-to-face or follow-up face-to-face with donors consistently to keep them totally engaged. I don't remember the numbers in front of me, but I can tell you I probably was doing, I don't know, 10 to 15 hours of fundraising a week as a dean. So my time was very, very heavily invested in that process.
Wow.
all the way to, I mean, nothing is going to beat face-to-face time if you can afford it, if you can do it. So I think with donors in particular, doing that is really key. Finding opportunities, and then finding opportunities to involve them. So I'll mention one last idea. For example, we knew that our donors really wanted to see students, but they also have kind of expertise to share. So we created an event in the college called Meet the Expert, where we would invite alumni donors to meet with students from across the college for coffee. It was super simple. Once a month, we'd have the expert, and then we'd bring pastries and food, and then students could meet, but in a very intimate format. So it was maximum 10 students. So students could get questions and really engage with people in that way. Again, that's another touching point that I think created a lot of, like, it's a win-win-win, right? The students win, the donor wins, the college wins. It's an event. So in the end, you can't make it better than that in my mind.
Love that. And Doctor, you mentioned something that really stuck with me. So you as a dean, were spending a considerable amount of time in development and with stewarding donors, and really making sure the advances of your specific college were ensured.
Yeah.
Now, I think that's the dream of every developer team, is to have deans as engaged and as hands-on as you were. So, taking a step back, you personally, what about development? What about advancement stuck out to you that made you want to be so involved with it?
Well, I mean, personally, I honestly found that process kind of magical, because once you get to know donors, there's kind of this perception that people have that you're really just, even from faculty, where you're just fishing for money, right? But actually, I found that we were fishing for connection, and that to me was so different, right? So that's part of the reason why I embraced it so much, is because I was meeting people. And I mean, I was in the room when people were tearing up because they knew that our students were struggling, and they get up right away and they write us a $5,000 check because they want that to stop, So when you see people being in this kind of mode of giving, it becomes contagious. It becomes inspiring. So to me, the donors were the real stars um, of it all. So that, I don't know, there was that piece, and then working with my colleague Christina on this was a highlight. I think that we struggled actually a little bit, and then the book I shared this story about how we really struggled, but somehow we found our way, and then we became a really solid team. And so to be such a strong team, and to be so passionate about and have a really great sense of the same vision and mission was inspiring, certainly inspiring me to do better. And the third I'll add is students. So for me, from my perspective, I don't think that has to be shared, but the whole goal was always about helping our students. I work at a university where a lot of our students are at risk. A lot of our students don't have the opportunities many of us have been blessed to give in. For them, like my student just finished her master's degree, it's like she's the first in the entire family to even get a degree. Needless to say, getting a graduate degree is a tremendous accomplishment. So to feel that, for me, it was always all about student success. If I could get funding from donors to support student success, for me, that was the ultimate goal.
I love that. I also love that you framed a lot of this discussion around building that relationship with not just donors, but also your team. And
Yeah.
working in higher ed, they're large institutions. So there's no doubt that there are a lot of different people to collaborate with and work with on a daily basis. And then your alumni populations and donor bases are also quite large.
Yeah.
You focus on positive communication, and philanthropy professionals are trying to drive more positive change in the world as well. So I heard you talk a little bit in one of your other talks about the butterfly effect. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and how we can use the butterfly effect to promote more positive change.
Yeah, thanks so much. People rarely ask me about the butterfly effect, but so the way I explain it, just so people who are listening and viewing the show can relate to it, is It's a simple concept. It comes from a meteorologist who asked, does the flapping of a butterfly in Japan affect a tornado in Texas? And the answer is it does. Now, I have no idea how this works, so I can't explain that process. But from the vantage point of communication, what I'm really interested in is, are there things that each of us can do that create a type of butterfly effect, right? So if I change the way I communicate, that will inherently change the way I create relationships and what they're all about. If I make that change, if I change the way I communicate, it can create a revolution in the teams that I lead and what I create in the workplace. It can create a revolution in my community. It can create a revolution even in my society. So, and I really believe that. So I'm a little idealistic, I guess you suppose, but I think if you practice some of these behaviors from the model, that you're going to see that change. It's like immediate, because relationships and connections are created by communication. It's not the other way around. Our communication creates what we have with people. If I make a change to lead towards meaningful practices, that's going to create meaningful relationships. So what does that mean? I mean, I think it means many things. One of them is that if you're leading a unit, then if you're the leader, you are setting in motion what people are going to aspire to doing and becoming. That's the definition of leadership. It's influencing people. And what you say and do inherently becomes the model from people's vantage point, whether it's conscious or unconscious. It's going to become the model for what they're going to aspire to do and become. So that's one kind of thinking. The other is, connected to performance. I have in front of me here a sentence that I really like. It says, the most important factor of employee performance is the quality of the relationship that the employee has with their supervisor. So think about that. Any of us who work somewhere, what really impacts how well we perform is the relationship that we have with the people we work with or for, depending on how you want to frame it. So if that person makes a change and I make a change, then performance is going to improve. So I think that if people decide to communicate positively, it's going to have long-term impact on themselves, on their relationships, but also hopefully some of the goals that they pursue at work. And I would add, degree of happiness. So I did maybe 8-9 years ago, I started a project called the Peak Communication Project. And that research was all about really interviewing people. So I interviewed people from all walks of life. I had graduate students helping me, and we sat them down, and all we would do is we would ask them, so tell us a story about a time when you had a conversation with someone that brought you joy, that brought you happiness. And we would listen, like, what happened? What did they say? Tell us the story of this whole thing. When they shared us one story, we would ask for a second. When they told us second story, we asked them for a third. So I've collected hundreds and hundreds of stories like this, okay? And I can tell you, because now we've studied them, that 97.7% of all conversations that bring happiness to people's lives are these 6 behaviors right here. So I think that's a butterfly effect too, right? Like if you want, I guess, meaningful connection, meaningful experiences, more moments of happiness, I believe that it begins with how you communicate.
I love that.
Now, Julien, you mentioned one of your latest piece of work you co-authored, Positive Communication for Leaders. Did you apply this model into that work when you're talking about communication specifically for leadership? Do you have any thoughts or insights as to how you would sort of tweak the knobs of these 6 frameworks, fine-tuned specifically for leadership?
Yeah, so what we did in this book, actually, so Positive Communication for Leaders, is we took my model that I developed that was very much kind of at the interpersonal level, right? Me and you. And we decided that we would scale it up. So we did describe, here's as a leader what you can do at the personal level, and you really need to make sure to do that. But here's also what to do at the group level. And here's also what to make sure to do at the organizational level. Same practices, but kind of scaling them up because the impulse is about the same. So we adapted the models at the heart. If you look at the book today, I think on page 8, you've got the model right there. So that's the framework for the book. But then it's really about, as a leader, how can I exercise these principles and try to scale them up along the way? So I'll give you an example with greeting, right? So the very basic thing that we're arguing here that a leader will do is he or she is going to be the initiator of the connection. You have to meet with your stakeholders and you have to create time for them, and ideally high quality time for them. So that would be kind of level 1, okay? Level 2, which is really at the group level, you want to create lots of opportunities for the people on your team to meet together. You've got to create connections. So I'll just give you an example. I do a lot of consulting on the side, and one of them was a nonprofit organization who reached out to me, who went from having a headquarters kind of in a town, and then they moved to becoming totally remote, right? So a few months after doing that, they come back and they're like, well, now we're all isolated. We feel completely lonely. Nobody is connected. Well, that's because team members are no longer spending time together. Research shows that good cultures are created by lots of small talk. So if you pay attention to the way we Zoom with one another, what do? We go straight to the task, right? We don't incorporate moments of connection as part of those meetings. You've got to be intentional. So at a higher level, I would say, if you're leading any team meetings, you want to create the opening of the meeting as a time for connection, particularly if you are doing a lot of remote work, because that's the only access people will have to human connection. And then the third level, which is, how do you do that at the organizational level? Well, you've got to think and dream big about some strategies to enact this basic principle. So my favorite example that I did when I was a dean is I really wanted to connect with students because they were my main stakeholder, right? Like I need to get to know them. What are the challenges that they're facing? What are they doing? And the simplest thing I did is every month I organized a student lunch with the dean. And I invited people from the entire college. I had 1,600 students. And every month I had about 18 to 25 students who would come. They were from all academic disciplines: psychology, sociology, anthropology, communication. Maybe they work for the radio station. And I would feed them lunch because a lot of our students have issues with poverty and not access to resources. So I want to make sure they were well fed. And all we did for 1 hour was talk about them. So I would get to know them, see what they're up to, what are they studying, what are they dreaming about. And then I would spice things up. Sometimes like, who's your favorite professor? And that, the students would always be, they're like, oh, I took this class from Dr. X and he or she was so awesome. And then that would allow me to come back and write a note to that faculty, right? I was just in a meeting with a student, they were beaming about you, and I could send in that note. So in the book, that's essentially what we try to do. We take the behavior and then we say, okay, here's what you can do at the individual level. Here's what you can do at the group level. Here's what you can do at the organizational level.
Love that. Very astute tool as well. I can only speak for myself, but when I was a student, whenever I was offered some free food, I would spill the beans. So you could ask me basically anything, and I was going to disclose that very same thing. So really, really awesome tool, Doctor. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for sharing all of your insights and wisdom today. What I really love about your theory is that it can be applied to all aspects of life and all types of relationships. And I love that you mentioned the taking the moment of gratitude out of your week as part of a work practice, for example, because in your case presentation, we did that together. And I remember exactly who I sent that message to, 4 or 5 years later now. And we've actually incorporated that because of that moment into our team meetings. And so we take a 2-minute break. Yes. So the work you're doing is making a difference. And
thank you.
And we can assure you of that. Now, if people want to learn more about the work that you're doing and about positive communication, where can they go to learn more?
Well, the easy things. First, you should follow me on LinkedIn. I sometimes, actually not sometimes, very frequently have content that I share. Sometimes it's a piece of advice. Sometimes it's an inspiring story. So join me on LinkedIn. The other is you can go to my website, www.julienmirivel.com. And then the other thing is I'm offering monthly workshops called the Positive Communication Workshop Series. So if you get connected with me, I can share some of those information. The next one that I'm leading is on May 24th, which will be a workshop on leading actually positively and how to create a positive culture within the team. So we'll look at 5 strategies to try to do that. And I also have online classes on a platform called Ruzuku. So currently I've got 2 of them. One is on the art of positive communication, and the other one is on leading difficult conversations during performance evaluations, but more are coming. So hopefully you can stay in touch with me, or you can email me, jcmirivel@mac.com.
I love that. And hopefully all of our listeners will do their part to set off that butterfly effect of positivity in the world. Dr. Mirivel, thank you again for sharing your expert insight. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. And to all of our listeners, thank you all for tuning in. Keep an eye out for more episodes of our Impact Unplugged podcast to hear more insights from experts like Julien.
If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, for more great content and insights, visit our website at www.funminer.com and follow us on LinkedIn.
That's a wrap for today. Until next time, keep maximizing your impact.